Come on, bienvenue, welcome to yet another Property Quorum, yet another one. Goodness, we have always, as ever, surrounded ourselves with property specialists. We have, of course, Hamish McClay of Surgical Bay, who helped set this thing up in the first place. A friend of the show, Silas J. Lees of Wiggywan, and a gentleman whose pen flows with property information, Rowan Waller of The Property Pen. And today we are talking about a topic which I'm hoping will intrigue most of us. Life after the landlord. Sounds very prophetic. And to start us off, as ever, Hamish McClay.
Well, it is sort of almost prophetic, and it's sort of something which we need to prepare for. And it's grand advice, I think, for those who work in a particular area of the property market. And it's not something which necessarily involves me over much, because I won't see much of it, because with us actually carrying out searches, looking at those sort of earlier on, it's what goes on in the background that makes it a very, very sort of complicated situation. And there's always this sort of aspect of, if you like, conveyancing, where it can get extended for a number of reasons. And this is one particular area where it can actually get extended. And it's more in the perspective, what we're speaking about today is really landlords. And I was reading an article briefly. I didn't have much time this morning, but I did pick it up briefly. And somebody was saying, mind you, it was one of the banks that was writing it. So maybe they're hoping to lend money on the basis of the article, which was almost sort of written by them, to suggest that landlords who actually company, if you like, landlords who are now a company, because many people, as we know, they switch to a limited company, but apparently those sort of people are looking forward and saying it's absolutely great. And the two or three people they spoke to, 93% suggested that everything was on the up. You never know about these statistics, do you? Who the heck they've asked? They never say who the sample is.
No, I always say 67.4% of statistics are made up on the spot. Silas, what the hell's going on? Can you help me make sense of this?
Well, good morning, Gareth. And this is an interesting topic. So many years ago, my take on this would be, I used to train a lot of would-be landlords, people getting into the market, wanting to start, build and grow a property portfolio. And that was quite interesting work. But I will say that it was quite a male-dominated environment, as one can imagine. And a lot of men were coming into the room. They had a partner that wasn't perhaps particularly supportive in terms of their ambitions to build a property portfolio. And as a consequence, they tended to operate in isolation. And so you would end up with landlords who have gone out, they've built a portfolio, maybe 3, 4, 5, 10 houses, whatever it is, over a course of a number of years. And then, of course, this final event that will come to us all unfolds either suddenly or, you have some foresight into it. And the problem is that if that individual has been managing the portfolio themselves and then they pass, then the family doesn't really know what's going on. There's no records about what's actually happening. It's all in their head. They don't really know the relationship with the tenant, of course. And a lot of things have now changed with the Renters' Rights Act. So it's not as simple to evict a tenant from a property, or it certainly won't be in a couple of weeks once this comes into fruition. So you can sort of foresee this scenario unfolding where family members are taking on a property portfolio. They don't know anything about it. The tenants are in limbo because maybe they've got repairs that need doing. Maybe they've got work that needs to be done to the property in some way. And they don't know who to talk to, that their particular contact is gone. So it's at a time when the family's experiencing a lot of grief. It's also at a time when nobody really knows what's going on, and there could be sanctions or penalties that follow at a time when it's most deeply emotionally unsettling. So, yeah, there's a lot to sort of discuss in this chapter, and of course, with going through a probate process is a very long-winded scenario itself. So it's not hard to imagine a scenario where a couple ends up owning, a 10 property portfolio. The tenants, for whatever reason, aren't paying the rent because maintenance isn't being done. We're stuck in a probate process. Nobody really knows what's going on. But all the time, that mortgage has to be paid And so it's not inconceivable to suggest that there will be some further stressful situations for the family to endure. And this is why I always encourage people to use a competent and comprehensive letting agent to support them with their property portfolio, because at least it takes away some of that emotional burden.
Wow. Rowan, it seems to me that people are perhaps downplaying the potential exodus of landlords from the property market. Is that what's going on?
No, I think they're absolutely overplaying. I think they're over. You're hearing it everywhere. You're hearing it everywhere. There are a number of landlords leaving the market. There are always landlords leaving the market. That number might be greater at the moment, but there hasn't been the exodus that the headlines have suggested. So there was some talk that you might get as many as 2/3 of landlords sell their portfolios. And actually, I think there was a figure that said 2/3 of landlords are considering selling a property that might be in a portfolio. So maybe one of a portfolio, say 10, like Silas is talking about. But I think your independent landlords, particularly your self-managing landlords, are going to be a little confused by the legislation that's coming in, although there's a lot of help out there that tells people exactly what is going on. And most of what's coming in the Renters' Rights Act is making common sense of, or making formal what common sense already did for people. So the biggest change is the end of Section 21. But actually, grounds-based possession is how you can evict tenants, and Section 21 was there to be able to evict tenants really without grounds. Just on a whim, you could evict tenants, and that's what it was there to protect. So in this scenario we're talking about, with say somebody has passed away, a landlord has passed away, and now you've got the representatives of the estate, or you've got the beneficiaries of the estate suddenly inheriting this property, who may not want to keep it as a let property, or perhaps they have to sell the property to pay the inheritance tax liability that's coming due. They are going to be able to sell that property. They're going to be able to sell the property with tenants in situ, but that might not be possible if there is this sort of lean towards a landlord exodus, and there's not a replacement of landlords in this same market. Although that's another story, it is happening, so we could talk about that separately. But the thing is that if you need to sell the property, or you want to take possession of the property for your own occupancy, those are both grounds for being able to evict tenants. I think this is potentially the only problem I could see in a probate situation with the Renters' Rights Act, where it could become problematic, is if a property has only just been agreed on a tenancy, and there's a 12-month protected period before a tenant is able to be evicted under any kind of grounds-based possession, right? So if you've just taken tenants on, and then you have a heart attack and die suddenly, because we're talking about sudden death rather than foresight death, where you might kind of try and plan these things in advance for your family if you're kind enough, then perhaps that's going to cause a problem, because you've suddenly got a situation where the beneficiaries might want to or need to sell this property within a 12-month period, and they're not able to. You're not able to actually do that because there's this 12-month protected period where tenants can't be evicted, whether there's grounds or not. But like you say, probate takes a long time. It's unlikely that it's going to be much before that 12-month period, if at all. And I think the inheritance tax liability, if there is one due, first you've got to get the probate to decide what that inheritance tax is going to be, and then secondly, there's a payment deadline. I don't know what that is. Somebody who's cleverer than me will tell me. Do you know what? I used to know when I was an estate agent, but it's one of those things that's just drifted out of my mind. I'd have to actually look it up. So I don't think there's probably not as many problems in the Renters' Rights Act as far as probate goes and death of a landlord goes as there are now, because ultimately the one thing that the Renters' Rights Act doesn't change, or not the one thing, but one thing that the Renters' Rights Act doesn't change is that effectively, when even now, so we're not in Renters' Rights Act yet, no. But if a landlord dies, that let property passes into the estate, and that's exactly what's going to happen under the Renters' Rights Act. So it's only this peculiarity under the 12 months that I can't necessarily put my finger on how it would work. But otherwise, if your beneficiary wants to get rid of the tenants in order to sell the property, for example, then that's going to be done. I think the really interesting point that Silas makes is if there's this backlog of maintenance that needs to be done, and there's just not the money there to pay for it, and then the beneficiaries have got this problem that the landlord already had, that may have been ignoring this problem or not able to cope with it because they were ill or whatever it may be. And now, how does the family raise this money, because it's now their responsibility, and it's a responsibility that's been foisted upon them rather than chosen by them. So Yeah, so that's probably a peculiarity that I need to think about a little bit more.
I've got a comment here from Deaf Spencer, as he calls himself, a friend of the show, a gentleman who is, as he so writes, is in fact deaf. In a world of petrol theft, spiraling inflation, and a terrifying uncertainty of the conflicts in Iran, we'll never have been more vulnerable as stuck renting. It's like living in a glass fortress where you pay a premium to remain exposed to every global shockwave while subsidizing someone else's safety net. Life after the landlord is no longer a luxury. It's a vital move towards sovereignty. Anyone want to jump in on this one?
I certainly wish I was as elegant as Spencer with my my wording, but look, he's right. I think I will say I don't think this problem is exclusively for tenants. We're all feeling the pinch of what's happening in the world. We actually, as a quick aside, we went to Costco 2 days ago, and I was walking around and looking at.
That's extremely dangerous, by the way, going to Costco.
I couldn't agree more. But what was interesting is when you look at some of the items that are for sale, the price isn't actually that much different to what it was maybe 5 or 10 years ago. So washing powder, for example, fairly standard across the board for a big box of washing powder, but it's all the other things that have spiraled so much. Your cost of food, etc., has gone up, as we all know, the cost of petrol. And so, yeah, I get where Spencer's coming from. It can feel precarious that you've got this, what is it, the sword of Diocles hanging over your head, that do I have tenure within this property for a longer period of time? And I totally get where tenants are coming from, and having that security of tenure is undoubtedly good. But here's one of the things that I do think people overlook. The business of being a landlord, for the majority of landlords, the overwhelming percentage of all the landlords that I've ever spoken to, is they are building a portfolio for long-term security or a pension. And so what they need more than anything is a good tenant that looks after the property and pays the rent on time. If you're matching that criteria, there is no need to ever evict a tenant. And I've told this story many times on these shows where I would have tenants in 5, 6, 7, 8 years and no, not one penny of rent increase during that period of time. And that's the bit that I think that these legislators overlook, is that they just think greedy landlords putting the rent up, etc. It's generally not the little guy, the small guy, the portfolio landlord. But what I have noticed, particularly, and we've all seen the jump if you look back at the numbers since 2020, that as more landlords have left, there is less availability, and of course that puts prices up, and that is just a factor of supply and demand. So I am reading lots of horror stories from tenants who are unable to find now a secure place to rent as a result of this, because there is less availability in certain areas. Not all tenants, of course, but I am seeing that quite vocally on the property groups that I'm in and on social media. So who knows how this is all going to play out.
I've got another question for you. This harks back to something I point out, and Rowan, you might want to step in on this as well. Looking at the German model, it's hardly a model, it's sort of a tendency whereby large corporations buy up all the ailing landlords' properties. So eventually you end up with, Tyrell Corp or whatever it's going to be, having owned most of the properties. And would that give a tenant more security because or less security in that scenario?
Look, I'm gonna opt for less. It'll be a far more regimented approach, I believe, with a corporate landlord. The German market has some peculiarities around buying and selling property. I think if you buy a property, you have to own it for 10 years before you can sell it. So they stop that trading of properties that goes on in the UK. I can't remember all the details around tenant security, but you're right. A lot of people in Germany rent rather than actually own their own property. And I think that's a tradition that's always been part of the British values, is that you get on the housing ladder, you move up the housing ladder over time, you build equity, etc. I think that's always been part of British values. It's a shame that picture is so disjointed now for a lot of people. Housing affordability is not there because of the cost of everything else, and it's preventing people getting the savings they need to contribute towards a housing deposit. But I'll turn over to Rowan because I'm sure he's got some things.
Yes, I was going to say, same question to you, Rowan. What are your thoughts?
I agree with Silas in a way. In many ways, I agree with Silas. I think so. Corporate lets are by nature going to be more regimented because they follow a structure, they follow a process. They've probably got a centralised office that deals with the tenant needs and etc. etc. But they are nevertheless going to be governed under the Renters' Rights Act. So the Renters' Rights Act is going to cover corporate tenancies. So it is going to still demand that that tenants have the protected 12 months, not 10 years. It's still going to take away Section 21, so they're not going to be able to get rid of tenants just because they're complaining about damp in the bedroom, for example. Tenants are still going to have this access to tribunal to be able to take landlords more easily to get some sort of recompense or get action taken if they aren't dealing with problems. That's coming down the line. That's not coming out in phase one. So there's an implementation.
But the cost of taking a landlord tribunal is at the lowest it's ever been, isn't it? It's relatively cheap for a tenant to do that.
Well, yeah, but there's going to be a new tribunal. I mean, the trouble is, so this is what's being proposed. It's what's being written into legislation, not just proposed. It's written into legislation. It's going to be phased in at another implementation stage. But the court system isn't yet. It's already over capacity, right? So they can't deal with the cases that are already going through. So unless they actually improve that system, this is going to fall flat. But in theory, if it works the way it's meant to work, then tenants are going to be able to have these things dealt with. But exactly as Silas says, it's what he said in his earlier piece. But the most landlords are interested in running good properties profitably, right? So they do look after them, they do maintain them. Tenants are happy to pay the rent. And I think the Renters' Rights Act is going to so you're going to have a limit on the number of times you can increase rent, right? So it's going to be once a year. I've never known a landlord increase rent more than once a year, ever, in my career in agency. So, I don't think these things they sound quite kind of frightening when they're broadcast, but actually, like I said earlier, they're sort of formalizing common sense. I think that most of the process of lettings is going to carry on fairly normally. The abolition of Section 21, I didn't really ever issue a Section 21 notice unless a landlord was looking to sell a property or take possession of it for themselves. So it's just that they're going to have to do it under a different section now, but the tenants are still going to have to abide by it. So I don't really see that there's going to be this huge change in the way that lettings is done, but there is a change in the structure of letting. So what we are seeing and the data tells us is that there are landlords leaving the sector. There are corporate landlords increasing in the sector. There's a lot more foreign money. There's a lot more foreign money buying in as corporate landlords and buying properties. And there's a lot more build to rent. So build to rent coming in as a corporation and building 300 units that are going to be let by this company. And that's so it's changing the makeup of the lettings market, but it's not necessarily diluting the number of properties available. It's just changing who is renting. There's no longer private rented sector. It's corporate lets. Younger landlords are stepping in. So millennials and Gen Z. I think millennial landlords made up 50% of incorporated lettings companies. Right. So 50% of them are now millennials, and I think 30% were Gen Z landlords. So it's got 80% of the market is now young people. But they're doing it corporately. They're doing it as companies. They're not coming in as independent private individuals buying a property and then letting it out under private rented sector. They're doing it as a limited company from the start. So they're coming in with a much more professional attitude. But exactly what Silas was talking about earlier, that you get when landlords do leave the sector, it drives the price of rent up. And that is happening in the south. It's happening a lot in London. It's happening a lot in the southeast because the yields are low. So where these new landlords are stepping in, they're stepping into the Midlands and they're stepping into the north of England, even if they're based in the south, because that's where the yields are higher. It's also where the properties are less expensive, so their barrier to entry is lower. So they're coming in and they're buying terraced houses in Hartlepool and letting them out and getting an 8% yield because they could buy 3 of them for the same cost as they could buy a 2-bedroom flat in London that only returns a 4.1% yield and has leasehold charges and everything else that goes with it. So there's a structural problem in the English system that is still going to be a problem, but actually in terms of the overall number of properties that float around in the rented sector, whether it's private or corporate, it's actually going to maintain a fairly similar level, especially as build to rent becomes a lot more prevalent over the next decade. That's just ramping up now since 2016. And over the next 10 years, you're going to see a lot more of it.
Hamish, do you think, in your opinion, as you see people doing searches, there's much more corporatization? Is that your vision? Is that your vision?
Well, we don't actually sort of see it through our particular sort of end, because we're working directly more often than not. Although we do work with investors, we do work with the developers. They tend to be like us. They tend to be the independent ones rather than the larger ones. And the same too with the property. We perhaps don't see that end of it. It's the solicitor who's acting on behalf of the client who would see that. So we don't see much of a change. It's just what we try and sort of look forward and think in terms, particularly my position, because I work with a large number of independent sort of search agents, that trying to look forward to see what is going to happen in the market. One of the things that concerns me, and Ronan and I spoke about this subject earlier in the week, is the length of the time some properties can stay on the market. If there is a hold up, for whatever reason, and it could be the landlord exiting through passing away rather than necessarily just sort of selling up, the properties can hang around for that little bit longer, which does frustrate the market to a certain extent. So I think the Renters' Right Act, which where there were so many complaints about it was doing this, it was doing that, it is so good to have somebody on board with Rowan's sort of knowledge to be able to actually sort of explain that it's going to benefit everybody, because there's an awful lot of common sense attached to it. And providing we apply this to common sense, it's not very often that we get regulations that are coming through that you can apply common sense to. But this one does look particularly useful for both the landlord and for the tenant, because it does mean a landlord coming in now, and as Rowan's explained, they're coming in with more knowledge. So it's going to benefit a much, much larger number of people because of this professional attitude to it. And I know one of the great things is, I mean, Silas has sort of been there. I imagine Rowan's probably been there. I don't know if he's actually owned properties. He's rented as well. But most people, the majority of landlords are genuine people. They want the best for their clients. And in all his work that sort of Rowan did when he acted as a letting agent as well, they would want to look after clients. So it's just that small minority. And unfortunately, this small minority can make an awful lot of noise.
Yeah,
I think this is the thing. The act is not without problems, so it's not a perfect act. I just think that actually it's probably not going to change too much when you get into it. There are some things it's going to change, and it's going to aggravate landlords, but most of it is they can cope with it. But it is a sledgehammer to crack a nut, because although you hear the horror stories, I think that's the thing.
Yeah.
Silas is hearing horror stories, but those are the stories that shout the loudest. Most tenants are just in there having a perfectly fine time and living their lives, and they're in there for 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 years as anyone else is, because they just carry on paying their rent. They might get a little increase once a year or whatever it is. They're happy with that because they understand that things are going up, or they might not. Silas never raised his rent in 10 years. So it depends on the landlord, but most tenants are going to be quite happy in properties, and therefore they're not banging the pans and making a noise about it. So I think that this act is taken up a lot of political space and a lot of news headlines, and it's frustrated a lot of landlords. But a lot of the exodus of landlords are because they're ready to take their pensions after being in the game for 25 years, and it's the sort of a natural enough time to sell up. It's the younger landlords stepping in. I think that's what we really just need to make sure is encouraged, that there is still a private rented sector of some sort, even if they're doing it under a corporate structure, because otherwise there's not going to be enough properties, because the government aren't building enough properties for social rent, and social housing providers aren't yet up to that sort of scale where they can scale up and do it. So you do need these individuals and these privately formed corporations to carry on taking on this burden of responsibility.
Wow. Hamish, would you care to take us home, please?
Well, I think that there's we take steps forward, and it's taking the best advantage of those steps forward. And like Rowan is saying, it's a corporate style of model, but it isn't corporate landlords. But there is structure to it, and that will actually benefit there's always going to be side effects, but they again are going to be the minority. And I think sort of looking forward, potentially, it was almost like I was looking at, and even if it was the bank that was saying it, there is a really sort of positive way forward for landlords. And it isn't all that sort of grief that we've been told about. And it's the multimedia, what they bring out, that unfortunately does make all of the noise. Yet the individuals, as Rose, they just get on with it.
It's all those sound bites, isn't it? I just want to thank Rowan Waller of the Property Pen for his sage advice, and Silas J. Lees for his years of experience. Thanks for setting us straight, and Hamish McClay for having footed the whole thing. And to all you out there, apologies I couldn't get more comments on, but we had a short period of time, and I just wanted to thank you all for watching. Remember, in these troubled times, keep your feet on the ground, keep reaching for the stars, and please try and look after your mental health. Until next week, bye-bye.